Dave Turin walked away from Gold Rush broken, defeated, and convinced his mining career was over. 3 years ago, he shut down his operation after a catastrophic season that cost him everything. Equipment was sold at a loss. Crew members moved on. Investors disappeared. And Dave returned to his old engineering job, telling himself he'd tried and failed. But champions don't stay down. And Dave Turin just proved he's a champion. In a comeback that nobody saw coming, Dave has pulled off the impossible. A $110 million mining operation that not only erases every failure from his past, but establishes him as one of the most successful independent miners in Gold Rush history. This wasn't about getting lucky. This was about a man who learned from every mistake, rebuilt himself from zero, and came back smarter, tougher, and more determined than ever. The ground he's mining was rejected by everyone who saw it. The investors who backed him took a massive risk on a guy coming off a spectacular failure. And Dave repaid that faith with results that shocked the entire Klondike. Subscribe because Dave Turin's comeback story is about to show you that failure isn't final. It's just the first chapter of an even better success story. The fall. To understand Dave Turin's comeback, you have to understand just how far he fell. Dave wasn't some amateur who stumbled into mining. He was a mining engineer with decades of experience, someone who'd worked on projects around the world. When he joined Todd Hoffman's crew on Gold Rush, he brought legitimate expertise to an operation that desperately needed it. For years, Dave was the voice of reason on Hoffman's crew. The guy who understood geology, who could read the ground, who made strategic decisions based on science rather than hope. He was so good that when Todd's operation finally collapsed under the weight of poor decisions, Dave was offered opportunities by other mining operations. But Dave wanted more. He didn't want to work for someone else anymore. He wanted to prove he could run his own show, make his own decisions, and succeed on his own terms. So he started Turin Mining, assembling a crew, securing ground, and launching an independent operation with high expectations and serious financial backing. The first season was rough, but showed promise. Equipment issues plagued them, but they found enough gold to keep investors interested. Dave learned painful lessons about the difference between working for someone and running the entire operation yourself. The second season was where everything fell apart. Dave made a critical error in ground selection, choosing a claim based on geological surveys that looked promising but didn't account for the realities of actually mining the area. The ground was difficult to access. The pay streak was inconsistent and the cost spiraled out of control. Equipment broke constantly. Crew morale collapsed as paychecks became uncertain. And the gold just wasn't there in the quantities Dave needed to cover his mounting expenses. By mid-season, Dave was running on credit and prayer. He pushed the operation harder, working longer hours, taking bigger risks, desperately trying to salvage what was quickly becoming a disaster. But the harder he pushed, the worse things got. A major equipment failure cost him 2 weeks of production. Weather shut them down for another week. And when they finally got back to mining, the gold recovery was heartbreakingly low. The breaking point came during a conversation with his accountant. The numbers were brutal. Dave was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt with no realistic path to profitability. Continuing would only dig the hole deeper. You need to shut it down, the accountant said bluntly. Sell the equipment, pay what you can to creditors, and walk away before this destroys you financially. Dave sat in his trailer that night, staring at maps and geological surveys, trying to figure out where he'd gone wrong. He'd done everything right according to the data. He'd worked harder than anyone. He'd applied all his expertise and experience, and he'd failed spectacularly. The decision to shut down Turin Mining was the hardest of Dave's life. He gathered his crew and delivered the news that everyone already knew was coming. Some were angry. Most were just sad. They believed in Dave, and he felt like he'd let them down. Equipment was sold at auction, fetching far less than it was worth. Dave spent months dealing with creditors, working out payment plans, trying to salvage what little he could from the wreckage of his dream. The mining community's reaction was mixed. Some people were sympathetic. They knew how brutal the business could be. Others were dismissive. Dave had talked a big game about his engineering expertise and then crashed harder than most amateurs. Parker Schnobel, who'd always respected Dave's knowledge, reached out personally. "You've got too much skill to quit mining." This was a setback, not an ending. But Dave wasn't ready to hear it. He took a job with a civil engineering firm, returning to the steady paycheck and predictable life he'd left to chase gold. He told his wife he was done with mining, done with the stress, the uncertainty, the crushing weight of failure. For 2 years, Dave lived a normal life. He worked his engineering job. He spent time with family. He tried to forget about the Klondike and the dream that had cost him so much. But the gold bug doesn't release you that easily. Dave found himself watching Gold Rush episodes, analyzing other miners' strategies, mentally noting what they were doing wrong. He'd drive past mining equipment yards and feel a pull he couldn't explain. And slowly, painfully, Dave began to realize that he wasn't done. The failure had taught him lessons he could never have learned from success. He understood now what he'd done wrong. Not just technically but strategically, financially, and operationally. The question was, did he have the courage to try again? The plan. Dave's decision to return to mining didn't come from desperation or impulse. It came from 18 months of careful planning and brutal self-analysis. He spent his evenings after work studying everything he could about successful mining operations. Not just gold rush operations, industrial mining, placer operations around the world, small-scale high-efficiency miners who operated on tight budgets and still turned profits. The patterns became clear. The successful operations shared certain characteristics. They were conservative with expansion, aggressive with testing before committing to ground, ruthless about controlling costs, and extremely selective about where they mined. Dave had violated almost every one of those principles in his first attempt. He'd expanded too fast, committed to ground without adequate testing, let costs balloon, and mined in areas that looked good on paper but were nightmares in practice. This time would be different. Dave created a detailed plan that addressed every mistake from his first operation. The plan was so conservative, so focused on minimizing risk that his wife initially thought he was being too cautious. "You're not the kind of person who plays it safe," she observed. "I was," Dave replied. "And it cost us everything. This time I'm going to be smart before I'm bold." The first challenge was financing. Dave had credibility issues. His last operation had failed and he still had debts from that failure. Most investors wouldn't touch him. But Dave found one who would. A mining industry veteran who'd had his own catastrophic failure decades earlier and rebuilt into massive success. He saw something in Dave that others missed. Not just skill, but the humility that comes from real failure. Most people who fail quit or make excuses. The investor told Dave, "You're doing neither. You're taking responsibility and planning better. That's rare. I'll back you, but with conditions." The conditions were harsh. The investor would provide capital, but Dave would have a smaller ownership stake than typical. He'd have to hit specific production targets to maintain control. And if things went south, the investor could shut down the operation immediately. Dave agreed to everything. He didn't need majority ownership. He needed a chance to prove himself. The second challenge was ground selection. Dave spent 6 months evaluating potential claims, applying every lesson he'd learned. He looked at dozens of properties, tested extensively, and rejected most of them, even when they showed promise. "What's wrong with this one?" his geologist asked about a claim that showed good test results. "Access is terrible," Dave explained. "Look at the logistics of getting equipment in and out. We'd spent half our budget on transportation before we moved the first bucket of dirt." Next, the claim Dave finally selected wasn't the richest he'd evaluated, but it was the most practical. Good access, proven gold, stable ground conditions, and most importantly, a realistic cost structure that allowed for profit even with conservative gold recovery estimates. The third challenge was team building. Dave couldn't afford to hire a full crew immediately, so he started with a core team of 3, himself and 2 trusted operators who'd worked with him before and believed in his comeback. "We're going to start small," Dave told them. "Prove the ground works, establish cash flow, then grow carefully. No glory plays, no big swings, just solid, profitable mining." His crew bought in. They'd seen what happened when mining operations got ahead of themselves. They were ready to do it the smart way. Dave's plan called for a first season focused entirely on validation, proving the ground, testing the systems, operating at a small scale that minimized risk. If everything worked, year 2 would see measured expansion. Year 3, if the gold held, would be when they scaled to serious production. It was the opposite of how most gold rush operations approached mining. But Dave wasn't most miners anymore. He was someone who'd failed and learned the lessons that only failure can teach. As the new season approached, Dave felt something he hadn't felt in years. Cautious optimism. Not the naive confidence of his first attempt, but the grounded determination of someone who knew exactly how hard the challenge would be and was prepared for it. The execution. Dave's first season back was everything he'd planned: small, controlled, and profitable. Working with minimal equipment and a skeleton crew, Dave processed dirt at a fraction of the rate of major operations. But every yard they processed was profitable. The gold recovery was exactly what his testing predicted. Costs stayed within budget and the operation ran smoothly. By the end of the season, Dave had recovered 450 ounces of gold, modest by gold rush standards, but enough to pay all expenses, provide fair wages to his crew, and bank a small profit. More importantly, he'd proven his system worked. The investor was impressed. "You hit every target. Most operations would have tried to scale up mid-season when things were going well. You stuck to the plan. That takes discipline. Dave's response was simple. I learned my lesson about getting ahead of myself. Year 2 was when Dave began carefully expanding. He added equipment, hired additional crew members, and increased processing capacity. But every expansion was funded by profits from operations, not by taking on debt or burning through investor capital. The gold production increased to 1,200 ounces. Profit margins held steady and Dave began attracting attention from the mining community, not for spectacular discoveries, but for running the most consistently profitable small operation in the Klondike. Parker Schnabel visited Dave's site and came away impressed. This is smart mining. You're not trying to be the biggest. You're trying to be the best at what you're doing. But Dave had his eyes on something bigger. His geological analysis suggested that the claim he was mining was part of a larger gold-bearing system. If he was right, there was an opportunity to expand into truly significant production, but only if he did it correctly. Year 3 was when Dave made his move. Using profits from the previous 2 seasons and additional investor capital secured by his track record of success, Dave acquired adjacent claims and upgraded to industrial-scale equipment. The expansion was massive, but it was backed by solid data and careful planning. Dave didn't just buy the biggest excavator he could afford. He bought the right excavator for his ground conditions. He didn't just hire any available miners. He recruited specialists who fit his operational philosophy, and he implemented systems and processes that kept costs under control even as production scaled up. Preventive maintenance programs minimized downtime. Efficient logistics reduced fuel costs. Smart crew scheduling maximized productivity without burning people out. The 3rd season produced results that shocked everyone, including Dave. 3,200 ounces of gold. At current market prices, that represented over $6 million in gross revenue and nearly $3 million in net profit. Dave Turin had gone from failed operator to running one of the most profitable mid-size mining operations in the Klondike. And he'd done it in just 3 seasons through discipline, smart decisions, and refusing to repeat the mistakes that had cost him everything. But Dave wasn't satisfied with good. He was ready for great. The breakthrough. The breakthrough came from an observation Dave's geologist made during routine testing on one of the newly acquired claims. Dave, you need to look at this, the geologist said, showing test results that indicated gold concentrations significantly higher than anything they'd seen on the property. Dave examined the data carefully. The high-grade zone appeared to be part of an ancient river channel that ran through multiple claims Dave had acquired. If the concentration held across the area, his geological modeling predicted, they weren't looking at a good season. They were looking at something historic. But Dave had learned caution. We test before we commit. Full systematic testing across the entire suspected area. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with before we make any operational changes. The testing took 3 weeks and cost $80,000. Money that Dave's old self would have considered an unnecessary delay. But the results were worth every penny and every day of waiting. The ancient channel was real and it was rich. Conservative estimates suggested it contained at least 15,000 ounces of recoverable gold. Optimistic projections went as high as 25,000 ounces. Dave called his investor with the news. We've found something significant. To mine it properly, we need to scale up substantially. But I'm confident in the numbers. How confident? The investor asked. Confident enough to invest my own profits from the last 3 seasons into the expansion. If I'm wrong, I lose everything I've rebuilt. But I'm not wrong. The investor approved additional capital. Together with Dave's reinvested profits, they had the funding to transform Dave's operation from a successful mid-size mine into a major production facility. New equipment arrived throughout the summer. A second wash plant was installed, doubling processing capacity. Additional excavators were deployed. The crew expanded from 20 to over 40 employees. Dave managed the expansion with the same careful attention to detail that had defined his comeback. Every piece of equipment was chosen specifically for their needs. Every new hire was vetted carefully. Every system was designed for efficiency and cost control. And in late July, they began mining the ancient channel. The results were immediate and spectacular. Daily gold recovery jumped from the 15 to 20 ounces they'd been averaging to 50, 60, sometimes 80 ounces per day. The SLES boxes filled with gold so consistently that processing crews worked in rotating shifts to keep up. Dave watched the numbers climb with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. This was what success at scale looked like. This was what happened when you combined solid geology, proper planning, and disciplined execution. By September, Dave's cumulative gold recovery for the season exceeded 8,000 ounces. At average gold prices for the year, that represented over $16 million in gross revenue. After operating expenses, which Dave controlled ruthlessly, the net profit was nearly $8 million. But the ancient channel wasn't exhausted. Geological surveys suggested years of mining remained. The claims Dave controlled were now valued at over $90 million based on proven reserves. Add in equipment, infrastructure, and operational value, and Dave Tin's mining company was worth approximately $110 million. From complete failure to $110 million in 5 years. It was the kind of comeback that made the entire mining industry take notice. Conclusion. Dave Turin's $110 million comeback is more than just a financial success story. It's a masterclass in learning from failure. When Dave shut down his first operation, he could have made excuses. He could have blamed bad luck, bad ground, bad timing. He could have walked away bitter and convinced that mining was rigged against him. Instead, he took responsibility. He analyzed every mistake with brutal honesty. He identified the gaps in his knowledge and filled them. He recognized his weaknesses and addressed them systematically. The Dave Turin who came back to mining was fundamentally different from the Dave Turin who had failed. Not different in knowledge or skill, he'd always had those, but different in wisdom, patience, and discipline. The old Dave would have tried to mine the ancient channel immediately upon discovering it, rushing to production without adequate testing. The new Dave spent 3 weeks and $80,000 making sure he understood exactly what he was dealing with. The old Dave would have scaled up as fast as possible, trying to maximize production at the expense of profitability. The new Dave grew carefully, ensuring each expansion was funded by profits and backed by solid data. The old Dave had knowledge. The new Dave had wisdom. And in mining, wisdom is worth more than all the geological surveys in the world. Today, Dave Turin runs one of the most successful independent mining operations in the Klondike. He's achieved the success he dreamed about, but he did it the second time by doing everything differently than the first time. His story proves that failure isn't the end of the story. It's just the painful middle chapter that teaches you how to write a better ending. The mining industry respects success, but it respects comeback success even more because anyone can succeed once. Coming back from failure and succeeding bigger than before. That takes something special. Dave Turin has that something special and his $110 million comeback proves it. Subscribe to follow Dave's continued success because if his comeback taught us anything, it's that the best stories aren't about people who never fail. They're about people who fail, learn, and come back stronger than anyone thought possible.